You can find a good man in the desert, but it's a whole lot easier to find a grave. Out here, the wind doesn't just whisper, it screams. And on this night, it was screaming bloody murder. The storm came out of nowhere, a biblical plague of sand and lightning that turned the New Mexico territory into a churning, brown sea. This kind of storm didn't just knock on your door. It took the door, the frame, and the whole damn wall with it. From inside his tiny, forgotten cabin, Thomas Whitmore watched it all unfold. His face, etched with the kind of lines that only time and trouble can carve, was pressed against the glass. For 3 years, this cabin had been his fortress of solitude, his self-imposed prison. Visitors were a myth, a ghost story you told yourself on lonely nights. Then he saw her, a flicker of movement against the apocalyptic backdrop, a figure not walking, but stumbling, fighting a war against the wind with every step. Her dark hair was a whip, lashing around a face he couldn't see. Her traditional dress, something he recognized as Apache, was plastered to her frame. She was losing, badly. Most folks would have bolted the door, stoked the fire, and counted themselves lucky to be inside. Most folks weren't Thomas Whitmore. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his worn coat, his old lantern, and plunged into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a freight train. It stole the air from his lungs and tried to rip the lantern from his hand. He leaned into it, a human battering ram against the raw power of nature. He could barely see, but he pushed forward, guided by instinct and the ghost of the woman in the storm. He reached her just as her legs gave out. She collapsed into the sand, a marionette with its strings cut. Thomas scooped her up. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile thing in his arms. He turned and fought his way back, the wind now trying to tear her away from him. He slammed the cabin door shut, and the world went silent. Or almost silent. The roar of the storm was replaced by the crackle of the fire in his stone hearth, and the ragged sound of the woman's breathing. He laid her down gently on his cot, the only bed he owned. She was young, maybe 20. Her features were strong, beautiful in a way that felt ancient and powerful. Even unconscious, she had an aura of defiance. He stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls of his lonely world. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny, fragile rhythm in the vast, roaring emptiness of his life. He brewed up some broth, the same simple meal of dried beef and wild onions that had kept him alive for 1,000 solitary nights. As he worked, he couldn't stop looking at her. The Apache didn't travel alone, especially not their women, and nobody, not even a fool, traveled in a storm like this. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. As the first light of dawn cracked the bruised sky, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep, and impossibly sharp. They scanned the room, took him in, and for a split second, he saw a flash of pure animal fear. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a calm assessment, an unnerving intelligence. "You're safe," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He held out a cup of broth. The storm's passed. She took it. Her hands were steady, graceful. She didn't thank him. She just watched him over the rim of the cup, her eyes seeming to peel back the layers of his soul. "Anyone would have done the same," he mumbled, feeling strangely exposed under her gaze. She lowered the cup. A small, knowing smile touched her lips, a smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not anyone, and certainly not a man with a price on his head." The cup in his hand felt suddenly cold. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy. He hadn't heard his real name in 3 years. He had buried it, burned it, scattered its ashes to the desert wind. "How do you know that name?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She set the cup down. "My name is Ayana, and I know because my people have been watching you, Thomas Whitmore. We've been watching you ever since you ran." Every muscle in his body went rigid. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was an appointment. He had been found. His past, the one he'd killed a part of himself to escape, had just walked through his door. "What do you want?" he demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward the old cavalry pistol he kept tucked under his shirt. Ayana didn't flinch. Her gaze was unwavering. "I'm not here for the bounty, Thomas. I'm here because of what you are. A ghost. A man who knows how to disappear. And right now, I need a ghost more than I need a gunslinger. She told him a story about her younger brother, Nakai, who had vanished weeks ago. The tribal elders thought soldiers or settlers had taken him, but Ayana knew better. Nakai was impulsive, drawn to the whispered legends of Spanish gold, the conquistador treasures that littered the territory like bleached bones. He wasn't just looking for stories, she said, her voice dropping. He found something he shouldn't have. He found a map. Thomas listened, a knot tightening in his gut. He knew about treasure maps. He knew they were tickets to a shallow grave. This map, Ayana continued, it belonged to a man named Marcus Doyle. Does that name mean anything to you? The blood drained from Thomas's face. Marcus Doyle. The name was a brand on his soul. The man who had been his captain in the cavalry. The man who had given the order. The man whose face haunted his nightmares. The reason he was hiding in this godforsaken corner of the world. Doyle is looking for the map, Ayana said, her eyes boring into his. He's hunting my brother. He's the reason I was running through that storm. His men were chasing me. They think I know where Nakai is. She leaned forward, her intensity filling the small cabin. My brother is smart. He knew Doyle would come for him, so he hid the map, and he left me a message, a secret only I would understand, a message that led me to you. It was a trap, not for him, but for Doyle. Her story wasn't just about a missing brother. It was about revenge, and she had just made him the bait. You're insane, Thomas whispered. Doyle isn't some prospector. He's a monster. He'll kill you, your brother, and anyone who gets in his way. I know, she replied, her voice dangerously calm. That's why you're going to help me. You know how he thinks. You know how he operates. You were his right hand. That was another life, Thomas growled. That life is about to come knocking on your door, she shot back. Doyle's men are close. When they find this cabin, they won't ask questions. They will burn it to the ground with both of us inside. Your solitude is over, Thomas. The only question now is whether you die hiding or die fighting. He stared at her, this impossible woman who had shattered his world in a matter of hours. He had spent 3 years trying to forget the man he used to be, but she saw him. She saw the soldier, the scout, the killer he had tried to bury. And the most terrifying part? For the first time in years, a part of that man wanted to live again. He spent the rest of the day in a haze of disbelief, in simmering rage. Ayana moved about his small cabin with a quiet efficiency that was both infuriating and impressive. She found wild herbs just outside his door he'd never noticed, and combined them with his meager supplies to create a meal that tasted more like real food than anything he'd eaten in years. She was turning his prison into a home, right before his enemies were about to burn it down. My grandmother taught me that food is medicine, she said, stirring a pot over his fire, for the body and the spirit. My spirit's going to need more than stew, he grumbled, cleaning his rifle with furious, methodical strokes. As night fell, the unspoken tension thickened. There was only one bed. He offered her the cot, preparing to sleep on the hard-packed dirt floor. His bones already ached at the thought. Don't be a fool, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. We're not settlers with delicate sensibilities. We're soldiers waiting for a battle. We share the bed. We sleep in shifts. He was stunned into silence. He lay down on the far edge of the cot, his back to her, acutely aware of her presence just inches away. The warmth radiating from her was a foreign, unsettling comfort. It had been years since he'd been this close to another human being. It felt like a betrayal of the penance he'd set for himself. Why, Thomas? She asked quietly in the darkness. Why did you run? What did Doyle make you do? The question hung in the air, a loaded pistol aimed at his heart. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were buried too deep, choked by shame and blood. He feigned sleep, listening as her breathing evened out. But he lay awake for hours, the ghosts of his past swirling in the firelight. The next morning, Ayana prepared to leave. But it was a ruse. They both knew it. Doyle's men will track me here, she said, tying a small pack. When they arrive, tell them I stole your horse and fled east. They'll believe you. A broken-down hermit isn't a threat. And you, he asked. I will circle back. I will watch. And I will find a way to get to my brother. She paused at the door, turning to face him. Her expression was serious, almost grim. When I was a girl, my grandfather told me about a spirit called the Chindi. It's the ghost that leaves a man's body at death. It's everything that was dark and vengeful in him. Marcus Doyle is a Chindi in the flesh. She looked at him then, and her eyes held a new, frightening clarity. And I think you have one inside you too, Thomas. You just haven't let it out yet. After she left, the silence of the cabin was deafening. It was no longer a refuge. It was a cage. He spent the day waiting, every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk sending his heart racing. He was a scout again. He felt the subtle shifts in the wind, smelled the dust on the horizon. They were coming. Late in the afternoon, while forcing himself to straighten the bed they had shared, his hand brushed against something tucked deep within the straw mattress. It wasn't his. His fingers closed around a piece of rolled leather, tied with a strip of sinew. His blood ran cold. He unrolled it. It was a map. But it was more than that. It was a masterpiece of detail. It showed landmarks he knew intimately, but it also showed trails and symbols he'd only ever seen in classified cavalry documents. Spanish markers, yes, but also Apache pictographs. And in the center, a location marked with an elaborate cross, and a single chilling word written in a familiar hand. Doyle's hand. The word was Asuncion. This wasn't just a map to gold. Asuncion wasn't a place. It was the name of a Spanish mission that had been wiped off the face of the earth 200 years ago. Wiped out by a native uprising. Legend said the mission's entire treasury, gold, silver, sacred relics, had been hidden before the final attack. But why was it here? Ayanna had told him her brother hid the map. But this felt different. This felt planted, a test, a piece of a puzzle he didn't understand. Was this the real map? Or a copy? A trap? His mind raced. Ayanna's story was full of holes. She knew his real name. She knew about Doyle. She led Doyle's men straight to his doorstep, then left him with a map that was pure dynamite. It didn't add up. Then a horrifying thought struck him. What if her brother wasn't a victim? What if Nakai wasn't running from Doyle, but was working with him? What if Ayanna was playing them both, trying to get the treasure for herself? The desert speaks to those who know how to listen, she had said. Right now, the desert was screaming a warning. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, and the players were about to make their move. He didn't have to wait long. Just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, he heard them. The steady, professional sound of approaching horses, not one or two, at least four. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were announcing their arrival, an act of intimidation. Thomas grabbed his rifle and flattened himself on the floor, peering through a small crack in the cabin wall. 4 riders emerged from the dusk, and in the lead, a figure that made the breath catch in his throat. Marcus Doyle. He looked older, crueler, a scar he didn't have before jagged down his left cheek. But it was him, the same arrogant posture, the same predatory stillness. The Chindi had come home. Doyle didn't dismount. He and his men sat on their horses, a silent, menacing jury. They surveyed the cabin, the single horse tied to the post, the curl of smoke from the chimney. Whitmore! Doyle's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding as a whip crack. I know you're in there. I can smell a coward a mile away. Send the girl out. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. The girl. So they knew she'd been here. His lie about her stealing his horse was dead before he could even tell it. She's not here, Thomas shouted back, his voice rough. Doyle laughed, a cold, empty sound. Don't play games with me, Thomas. We tracked her right to your door. This is your only chance. Give her up, and I might let you crawl back under your rock. Refuse, and we'll burn this shack to the ground with you inside. Thomas's mind was a whirlwind. This was it. The moment he had dreaded for 3 years. His past had not just found him, it was threatening to incinerate him. He had 2 choices. Die for a woman he barely knew, a woman who was probably using him, or betray her to the monster he'd once called captain. But then Ayanna's words echoed in his mind. They will burn it to the ground with both of us inside. She had known this would happen. She had predicted it perfectly. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was part of a plan. Her plan. And as he looked through the crack at the smirking face of Marcus Doyle, a third option began to form. A dangerous, insane option. He wouldn't hide. He wouldn't betray. He would fight. But as he raised his rifle, a flicker of movement to the west caught his eye. On a distant ridge, silhouetted against the dying sun, was a lone figure. It was Ayanna. She was watching, and she wasn't alone. As his eyes adjusted, he saw other shapes materializing from the rocks around her. 1, 2, 5 Apache warriors, armed, ready. This wasn't a rescue party. This was an ambush, and he was the cheese in the trap. A cold fury, colder than any fear, washed over him. He wasn't just bait. He was a disposable piece in her game of revenge. She was willing to let him die, to let his cabin burn, just to get a shot at Doyle. Doyle's men were getting impatient. One of them dismounted, carrying a torch. "Last chance, Whitmore," Doyle yelled. Thomas made a decision. It wasn't for Ayanna. It wasn't for Doyle. It was for himself. He was done being a pawn. He was done being a ghost. He threw open the cabin door and stepped outside, his rifle held steady at his shoulder. The sight aimed directly at Doyle's black heart. "You want to fight, Marcus?" Thomas said, his voice ringing with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "You've got one, but it won't be the one you're expecting." Doyle's smirk faltered. He looked from Thomas's determined face to the setting sun, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He was a predator, and predators know when the landscape of the hunt has suddenly, inexplicably changed. Before Doyle could react, Ayanna raised a hand. It was a signal. From the ridge, a single piercing whistle cut through the air, and all hell broke loose. It wasn't just Ayanna and her warriors on the ridge. Doyle's men suddenly cried out in alarm, looking behind them. From the east, another group of riders was charging, emerging from the cover of a dry wash. But they weren't Apache. They were white men, rough-looking settlers, armed with rifles and pistols. Doyle was surrounded, a pincer movement. He was trapped between the Apache on the ridge and these new riders, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He had walked into a meticulously planned kill box. "What is this?" he roared, spinning his horse around. But the new riders weren't looking at him. They were looking at Thomas. Their leader, a big bearded man, raised his rifle in a salute. "We got your message, Whitmore," he yelled. "Just like the girl said. Said you were bringing the devil to justice." Thomas's mind reeled. My message? He hadn't sent any message. Ayanna had. She hadn't just arranged for her own people to be here. She had rallied the local settlers, people who had been terrorized by Doyle's gang for months. She had used his name, the name of the hermit, the outsider, as a banner to unite them. She hadn't seen him as disposable bait. She had seen him as a leader, a symbol. She had gambled that the soldier inside him wasn't dead, just sleeping. Doyle's men, seeing they were hopelessly outnumbered, began to panic. The firefight was short and brutal. The settlers and the Apache warriors worked with a terrifying efficiency, cutting off every escape route. It was a massacre. Thomas never took his eyes off Doyle. Amid the chaos, the two men were locked in their own private world. Doyle, snarling like a cornered wolf, drew his pistol and spurred his horse directly at Thomas. He was going to take down the man who had orchestrated his doom. Thomas stood his ground. The world slowed down. He saw the flash from Doyle's pistol, heard the bullet sing past his ear. He squeezed the trigger of his rifle. The weapon kicked against his shoulder, a familiar, brutal comfort. Doyle jerked in the saddle. A dark stain blossomed on his chest. His horse reared, and he tumbled to the ground, landing in a heap in the dust. Silence fell. The sharp smell of gunpowder hung in the air. It was over. Ayanna and her warriors came down from the ridge. The bearded settler dismounted and walked toward Thomas, his hand outstretched. "Never thought I'd see the day. You did good, Whitmore." Thomas barely heard him. He walked over to where Doyle lay, gasping, his life bleeding out into the sand. Doyle looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You, a hermit. How?" "You were wrong, Marcus," Thomas said, looking down at his former captain. "I wasn't hiding from you. I was waiting. It was a lie, but it was the best lie he'd ever told. A faint smile touched Doyle's lips. The map. Asuncion. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've just started. He coughed, a spray of blood dotting his lips. It's not about the gold, you fool. It never was. And then he died. His final words hung in the air, more chilling than any threat. It's not about the gold. Ayanna came to his side. She looked at the bodies of Doyle's men, then at Thomas. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, weary resolve. My brother is safe, she said. He's with the settlers. He's the one who told them where to find you. Everything clicked into place. The whole story had been a fabrication, a brilliant, calculated lie designed to pull him into her war. Her brother wasn't missing. He was her partner in this deception. You used me, Thomas said, the words flat, emotionless. Yes, she admitted without shame. I used the legend of Thomas Whitmore, the soldier who vanished, the only man Marcus Doyle ever feared. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist coming for you himself. It was the only way to draw him into our trap. He should have been furious. He should have felt betrayed. But all he felt was a strange, hollow emptiness. The ghosts he'd been running from were finally gone, but he wasn't sure what was left. What did he mean? Thomas asked, his gaze fixed on Doyle's body. It's not about the gold. Ayanna's expression darkened. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out the leather map, the one he had found in his mattress. Because this isn't the real map, she said, her voice barely a whisper. This is a decoy, a forgery my brother made. The real map is something else entirely. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the twilight sky. Doyle didn't want the Spanish treasure. He wanted what was buried with it, something far more dangerous. And now that he's dead, his employers will come looking for it. Thomas stared at her, the full, terrifying scope of the situation finally dawning on him. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He hadn't just stepped back into his old life. He had stepped into a brand new war, and Doyle was just the first casualty. The night was cold. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The settlers, their vengeance sated, rode back to their homesteads, leaving Thomas and Ayanna with the Apache warriors and the deafening silence of the desert. Who are his employers? Thomas asked, the question feeling heavy and dangerous. Ayanna fed another piece of sagebrush into the fire. The flames licked at the wood, casting long, dancing shadows. When my brother was tracking Doyle, he overheard a conversation. Doyle wasn't working for himself. He was taking orders from a man named Judge Alistair Croft. Thomas knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Judge Croft was more than a judge. He was a kingmaker, a railroad baron, a man who owned politicians and pulled the strings of the entire territory from his mansion in Santa Fe. He was untouchable. What would a man like Croft want with a lost Spanish mission? Thomas wondered aloud. That's the question, isn't it? Ayanna said. She finally looked at him. My brother Nakai, he didn't just forge a map. He found the real one. He took it from one of Doyle's scouts. But it wasn't a single map. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. It was two halves of a map. One half, drawn on old Spanish parchment, leads to the mission of Asuncion. The other half is drawn on tanned hide in Apache markings. It leads to the same place, but by a different path, a secret path. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. A collaboration, a Spanish priest and an Apache shaman working together hundreds of years ago. It was unheard of. Nakai has a Spanish half, Ayanna continued. He gave the Apache half to me for safekeeping. Doyle only knew about the Spanish part. He never knew the Apache were involved. So the real prize at Asuncion requires both halves of the map to find, Thomas surmised, and Judge Croft wants it. He wants it badly enough to hire a man like Doyle, she confirmed, which means it's worth more than gold. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through Thomas's exhaustion. The map I found, the decoy, where did Nakai get the details? The cavalry markings, the specific landmarks? Only a scout would know those. Ayanna's gaze faltered for the first time. She looked away toward the fire. Nakai, He wasn't always on the right path. A few years ago, he was young, angry. He fell in with a bad crowd. Treasure hunters, grave robbers. He worked for Doyle for a short time. The betrayal was a physical blow. He worked for Doyle? Thomas repeated, his voice dangerously low. The man who was hunting him? He left as soon as he realized what kind of man Doyle was, she said quickly. He saw the things Doyle did. It changed him. He's been trying to atone for it ever since. That's how he knew so much. It's how he knew about you. Doyle spoke of you. He was obsessed with the soldier who got away. So the connection wasn't a coincidence. It was a scar from the past. Nakai's past and his own. The web was more tangled than he could have imagined. The eldest of the Apache warriors, a man with a face like a weathered rock named Taza, approached the fire. Doyle is dead. The threat is gone. We should go. No, Ayanna said, her voice firm. The threat isn't gone. It's just changed its face. Croft won't stop. He'll send more men. Better men. They won't stop until they get what they want. Then we destroy the maps, Taza said simply. Let the secret of Asuncion die forever. And let Croft win? Ayanna shot back, a fire in her eyes. Let him keep the power he has. The power he built on the bones of our people? No. We need to find out what's in that mission. We need to find out what he's so afraid of. She turned her gaze back to Thomas. And we still need you. More than ever. Thomas looked from Ayanna's passionate face to Taza's stoic one. Taza was right. The smart play was to walk away, disappear again, find a new rock to crawl under. He had done his part. Doyle was dead. His personal demons were exorcised. But Doyle's last words echoed in his head. You have no idea what you've just started. And the look in Ayanna's eyes. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, a concept he had long ago dismissed as a fairy tale. Even with both halves of the map, Thomas said, thinking tactically, it's a week's ride into the Mescalero Badlands, hostile country, and will be hunted every step of the way. Croft will have riders blanketing the territory looking for us. We will not be hunted, Taza said with grim certainty. We will be the hunters. I have an idea, Ayanna said suddenly. A way to turn Croft's power against him. He's not the only powerful man in this territory. He has a rival, a rancher named Elias Vance. Vance has been fighting Croft over water rights for years. They hate each other. What if we could convince Vance that helping us would hurt Croft? It was a bold, dangerous strategy, playing two powerful, ruthless men against each other. Vance is no friend to the Apache, Taza warned. He doesn't have to be our friend, Ayanna countered. He just has to be Croft's enemy. You, she said, pointing at Thomas, you're a white man, a former soldier. He might listen to you. Thomas felt like he was being swept away by a river. Every time he thought he had found solid ground, the current pulled him back in, deeper and faster than before. Go to a powerful rancher and pitch an alliance to raid a lost mission based on a secret map to thwart a corrupt judge? It was the plan of a madman. But as he looked at the firelight dancing in Ayanna's determined eyes, he heard himself say, Where do we find this, Vance? The journey to Elias Vance's ranch was a tense, furtive affair. They traveled by night, using the Apache's intimate knowledge of the land to move like ghosts through a territory that was now crawling with Croft's spies. Taza and two other warriors escorted them, their senses preternaturally sharp, their presence a silent, deadly promise of protection. Nakai, it was decided, would lay low, a hidden ace up their sleeve. During the long nights, Thomas and Ayanna spoke little, but a silent understanding grew between them. He saw the weight of leadership on her shoulders, the burden of a war she had started. She, in turn, seemed to see past the hermit and the soldier to the man underneath who was slowly, painfully, coming back to life. Vance's ranch was less a home and more a fortress. A sprawling adobe compound surrounded by high walls, perched on a mesa that commanded a view of the entire valley. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Elias Vance was a man who expected trouble. They were stopped a mile out. Taza and the others melted back into the landscape, a contingency plan already in place. Thomas and Ayanna rode forward alone. Vance met them in his study, He was a bull of a man, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush stone. His eyes were small, shrewd, and deeply suspicious. "I know who you are," Vance said, his voice a low rumble, gesturing for them to sit. "I heard what happened to Doyle's crew. The whole territory is buzzing about it. They're calling you the ghost of the Badlands." He didn't smile. "I don't believe in ghosts, so tell me what you really want." Thomas laid it out. The story of the map, the mission of Asuncion, and Judge Croft's obsessive interest in it. He spoke calmly, factually, leaving out the personal details, framing it as a strategic opportunity. Vance listened without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Thomas was finished, the rancher was silent for a long time. "Croft is a snake," Vance said finally, "and I'd love nothing more than to cut his head off. But this story of yours, a lost Spanish mission, a secret treasure, it sounds like a fool's errand. Why should I risk my men and my resources on a bedtime story?" This was Ayana's cue. She stepped forward and placed her half of the map on Vance's massive oak desk. The tanned hide was covered in symbols and markings that were clearly ancient and authentic. "This is not a story, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is my people's history. My ancestors made a pact with a Spanish priest who believed his own church had become corrupt. They hid something together, something they believed was too powerful for men like Croft to control." Vance stared at the map, his calculating eyes tracing the lines. "This is Apache. I can't read this." "But I can," Ayana said, "and Mr. Whitmore has seen the other half, the Spanish half. Together they lead to Asuncion. We're not asking for your charity. We are offering you a partnership. Whatever wealth we find, we split three ways. One for you, one for my people, and one for Mr. Whitmore. But the real prize is whatever secret Croft is after. Imagine what you could do with that kind of leverage over him." The hook was set. Greed and ambition warred in Vance's eyes. He wanted to believe it, but he was a cautious man. "It's too risky," he said, shaking his head. "Croft has the law in his pocket. If we're caught, he'll hang us all as trespassers and thieves." Thomas saw their opportunity slipping away. He had to play his last card, the truth. "It's not about the law, Vance," Thomas said, his voice dropping, becoming intensely personal. "It's about the man. I served under Croft's man Doyle in the war. I know what they're capable of. This isn't about a land dispute or water rights. With men like them, it's always about blood. Sooner or later, Croft will decide this territory isn't big enough for the both of you. He won't use the law. He'll send men in the night to burn this place to the ground with your family inside. This isn't a partnership. It's preemptive self-defense." The words hit their mark. Thomas's raw conviction, the authority of a man who had seen the devil up close, cut through Vance's pragmatic defenses. He looked from Thomas's haunted eyes to Ayana's defiant face. "All right," Vance said, slapping his hand on the desk. "All right, I'm in. But we do this my way, quietly, no army, just a small, fast team, my best men, and you two." He pointed a thick finger at Thomas. "But if this is a trick, Whitmore, if you lead us into a trap, I'll kill you myself." The alliance was as fragile as a desert mirage, built on a foundation of mutual suspicion and greed. Their team was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Thomas, the haunted soldier, Ayana, the cunning Apache leader, Vance's two top guns, a pair of grim, silent mercenaries named Cobb and Reno, and Vance himself, too distrustful to let them go without him. They met Nakai at a prearranged location, a hidden spring deep in the foothills. Ayana's brother was younger than Thomas expected, with a restless energy and eyes that darted around nervously. He handed over the Spanish half of the map, avoiding Thomas's gaze. The shame of his past association with Doyle, a visible weight upon him. When the two halves of the map were laid side by side, they formed a complete picture. It was ingenious. The Spanish map was a traditional topographical chart, useless without the Apache half, which provided the context, the secret trails, the meaning of the symbols. One was the lock, the other was the key. The journey into the Mescalero Badlands was brutal. The landscape was a jagged, sun-blasted hell. Every shadow could be an ambush, every rock formation a sniper's nest. The tension within the group was thick enough to choke on. Cobb and Reno watched the Apache siblings with open hostility, while Vance constantly questioned Thomas's every decision. On the fourth day, they found it. A narrow canyon, its entrance almost perfectly concealed by a rock slide. The map called it El Paso del Lamento, the Passage of Sorrow. As they rode into the canyon, the temperature dropped. The high rock walls blocked out the sun, plunging them into a premature twilight. The air was still, dead. An unnatural silence pressed in on them. At the far end of the canyon stood the ruins, the mission of Asuncion. It wasn't grand. It was a humble, crumbling adobe church, its bell tower a jagged stump against the sky. A few outbuildings had collapsed into mounds of earth. It felt like a place of profound sadness, a place where something terrible had happened. "The map says the entrance is beneath the altar," Nakai whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Inside the church, the air was thick with the dust of centuries. Ghostly shafts of light pierced the gloom through holes in the roof. The stone altar was still intact, a massive slab of granite. It took all 5 men to push it aside, the grinding sound echoing like a scream in the silence. Beneath it was a heavy wooden trapdoor, bound with rusted iron straps. Cobb broke the lock with the butt of his rifle, and they heaved the door open. A wave of cold, musty air washed over them. A flight of steep stone steps led down into utter blackness. "This is it," Vance breathed, his eyes gleaming with avarice. Reno lit a lantern, and they descended into the crypt. The chamber was small, circular, and lined with burial niches. In the center of the room, there was no pile of gold, no glittering treasure. There was only a single large, dust-covered wooden chest. It was surprisingly plain, bound in simple iron, and sitting on top of the chest was a human skull. "What is this?" Vance growled, his disappointment palpable. "Where's the gold?" Cobb moved forward and kicked the chest. "It's probably full of worthless religious junk." "Don't touch it!" Ayana cried out, her voice sharp with alarm. She was staring at the walls, at the burial niches. "This isn't a treasury, it's a tomb." Thomas raised his own lantern. In the flickering light, he could see what she saw. The niches weren't empty. They were filled with the small skeletons of children. Dozens of them. A cold dread, heavier and more terrifying than any enemy, settled over him. "What happened here?" Reno whispered, his bravado gone, replaced by a look of horror. Nakai, who had been studying the markings on the wall near the entrance, let out a choked cry. "It's not a mission," he said, his face pale. "It was never a mission. The priest who built this place, he was a heretic. He ran an orphanage. The records, the markings say he was poisoning the children. The Apache, my ancestors. They didn't attack this place. They came to liberate it, to stop the monster." The truth was sickening. The pact wasn't to hide treasure. It was to seal away a great evil, to create a tomb to contain a nightmare. "So the chest," Thomas began. "It must be his records," Ayana finished, her voice filled with revulsion. "The priest's journals, the proof of his sins." Vance spat on the floor. "Proof? Who cares about the sins of a dead Spanish priest? There's no gold. This was a complete waste of time." He turned his furious gaze on Thomas and Ayana. "You tricked me." "We didn't know," Thomas said, his mind racing, trying to process the horrifying discovery. But something still didn't add up. Why would Judge Croft, a man of immense power and wealth, be so desperate to get his hands on the journals of a murderous priest from 200 years ago? It made no sense. Unless... Thomas's blood ran cold. He walked over to the chest. The wood was old, but not Spanish old. It was American pine. The iron straps were new, maybe 30 or 40 years old. This chest hadn't been here for 2 centuries. "This is not the priest's," Thomas said slowly, his hand resting on the lid. He looked at Cobb and Reno. The 2 mercenaries had their hands on their pistols. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at Vance. A slow, cold smile was spreading across Cobb's face. "He's right," Cobb said, his voice casual. "It's not. But what's inside? is worth more than any Spanish gold. Vance stared at his men, confusion turning to rage. What are you talking about, Cobb? Whose side are you on? The winning side, Mr. Vance, Reno chimed in. He drew his pistol and aimed it squarely at the rancher's chest. We work for Judge Croft, always have. He planted us with you years ago. The betrayal was swift and absolute. Vance stared at his trusted men, his face a mask of disbelief. Croft knew you were his biggest rival, Cobb explained, clearly enjoying the moment. He knew that sooner or later one of you would have to go. So he played the long game, waited for the right opportunity, and you, he sneered at Ayanna, you delivered it right to his doorstep. What's in the box, Cobb? Thomas demanded, his voice dangerously level. Cobb's smile widened. Leverage, the foundation of the Croft Empire. You see, the judge's great-grandfather wasn't some railroad tycoon. He was a humble army doctor, the doctor assigned to this territory back when it was first being settled. And he found this place. He gestured around the crypt. He found the priest's journals, the story of the poisonings, and being an enterprising man, he continued the research. He used the local Apache tribes, the children nobody would miss, to perfect new kinds of poisons, new diseases, all documented in his own journals, which he added to the priests, a legacy of evil. Thomas felt sick. This crypt wasn't just a tomb, it was a laboratory. During the war, Cobb continued, those journals became very valuable. A certain Union general used that research to remove some inconvenient tribal leaders who were standing in the way of progress. It was all very effective and all very illegal. A single name exploded in Thomas's mind. The name of the general he had served under. The man who had given the order at the Sand Creek Massacre. A man who after the war had become a powerful U.S. senator. A man who was Judge Croft's staunchest political ally. General Palmer, Thomas whispered. Cobb's eyes widened in genuine surprise. Well, look at that. The ghost knows his history. He chuckled. Yes, the good General Palmer. Judge Croft has been using his great-grandfather's journals to blackmail the senator for decades. It's the source of all his power, his get-out-of-jail-free card. But the original journals were getting old, Reno added. Fragile, and Croft was getting paranoid that someone else might find them. So he hired Doyle to retrieve them. The plan was to bring them back to Santa Fe, where they could be secured in a proper vault. It all made sense now. The obsession, the secrecy. This chest didn't contain wealth. It contained the dirty secret that held the entire power structure of the territory together. So what now? Vance growled, his hand inching toward his own gun. You kill us all? That's the plan, Cobb said cheerfully. We kill you, take the chest, and tell the judge that Vance and his new Indian friends got greedy and killed each other over a mythical treasure. A tragic, but tidy, end of the story. Before Cobb could finish his sentence, Vance drew his pistol. He was fast for a big man, but Reno was faster. A single shot echoed in the enclosed space, deafeningly loud. Vance staggered back, a look of shock on his face, a red hole in his gut. He collapsed to the floor. In that split second of chaos, Thomas reacted. He didn't draw his gun. He kicked the heavy wooden chest with all his might. It slid across the dusty floor and slammed into Reno's legs, sending the gunman sprawling. Ayanna was already moving. She threw a handful of dirt from the floor into Cobb's face. He roared in anger, firing blindly. The bullet ricocheted off the stone wall, inches from Nakai's head. Thomas launched himself at Cobb, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled in the dirt, two desperate animals fighting in the dark. Cobb was stronger, but Thomas was fueled by a cold, righteous fury he hadn't felt since the war. From the corner of his eye, he saw Nakai grab a heavy rock and bring it down on the head of the still-dazed Reno. The gunman went limp. One down. Ayanna drew a long knife from her boot and circled the two brawling men, looking for an opening. Cobb managed to throw Thomas off. He scrambled to his feet, raising his pistol. He had a clear shot. Thomas knew he was dead. But then, a voice echoed from the top of the stairs. Drop it. It was Tassa. He and the other two Apache warriors stood at the entrance to the crypt, their rifles aimed with deadly precision. Cobb had been so focused on the fight inside, he'd completely forgotten about the sentries outside. Cobb froze. He looked from the rifles aimed at him to the knife in Ayanna's hand to the fury in Thomas's eyes. He was trapped. His cheerful arrogance evaporated, replaced by the cornered rat panic of a man who knew the game was up. He made a fatal mistake. He tried to bargain. "Wait," he stammered. "We can make a deal. Croft will pay anything to get these journals back." He never finished the sentence. Taza's rifle cracked, the sound like the judgment of God in the silent tomb. Cobb was thrown backward, a neat hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He landed in a heap next to the body of Elias Vance. Silence returned to the crypt, thick and heavy, smelling of blood and gunpowder in disturbed earth. They had survived. They had the chest. They had the secret that could tear the territory apart. But as Thomas looked at the bodies on the floor, at Ayanna's grim face, and at the dark, damning chest, he knew the truth. The war wasn't over. It had just escalated to a level he could never have imagined. They weren't fighting a corrupt judge anymore. They were fighting the entire system he controlled, and they were running out of time. They sealed the tomb, rolling the stone altar back into place, entombing the bodies of Vance and his treacherous men with the ghosts of the poisoned children. It felt right, a dark place for dark deeds. They loaded the heavy chest onto a pack horse. It felt like they were carrying a coffin. In a way they were, the coffin of Croft's empire, or their own. "We can't go back," Taza stated, his words hammering home the reality of their situation. "Croft will have the roads watched. He'll have passes, bounty hunters, maybe even the territorial cavalry looking for us. He can't afford to let that chest reach Santa Fe." "We don't go to Santa Fe," Thomas said, his mind already working, the old instincts of a scout and a fugitive taking over. "That's what he'll expect. We do the opposite. We go deeper into the Badlands. We go where no posse would dare to follow." Ayanna looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. The Malpais, the lava fields. It was a suicidal notion. The Malpais was a vast, jagged expanse of black volcanic rock, a waterless, trackless maze where a man could die of thirst 100 feet from his own trail. But it was also the one place they might be safe, the one place Croft's men couldn't easily follow. "We take the chest to my people's stronghold in the heart of the Malpais," Ayanna declared. "From there, we decide our next move." The journey was a waking nightmare. The black rock radiated the sun's heat, creating a furnace-like environment. The sharp, glassy edges of the lava shredded their horses' hooves and their own boots. Water was more precious than gold. Every sip was measured, every drop guarded. Nakai, surprisingly, thrived. In this harsh, unforgiving landscape, his nervous energy found a focus. He proved to be an adept pathfinder, spotting game trails and hidden water seeps that saved them more than once. The guilt he carried seemed to be burning away under the relentless sun, replaced by a quiet competence. He was finally atoning. During a rare stop in the shade of a rock overhang, Thomas examined the chest more closely. He found the lock and, using Ayanna's knife, managed to pry it open. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, were two thick, leather-bound ledgers. The first was filled with elegant, spidery Spanish script, the priest's journal. The second was written in a more modern, scientific hand, the doctor's journal. Thomas couldn't read the Spanish, but he could read the English. He opened the second journal. The clinical, detached descriptions of the experiments performed on living subjects made his stomach churn. The doctor, Croft's ancestor, had been a monster, a butcher hiding behind the guise of science. And then he found what he was looking for. The later entries, dated during the war. Detailed notes on the field application of a compound derived from Jimson weed and river clay. A poison that induced paralysis and a terrifying, agonizing death. The entry was signed not by the doctor, but by the man who had requested the research. A signature Thomas recognized from 100 military dispatches. General Palmer. But there was something else. Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded piece of paper. A deed. A territorial land grant, signed by the governor himself. It granted sole ownership of a vast tract of land, 100,000 acres, including the river and several valuable mineral deposits, to a single individual. The name on the deed made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't Palmer. It wasn't Croft. It was Marcus Doyle. The date was just a few weeks old. This was Doyle's payment for retrieving the journals. Croft wasn't just going to secure the evidence. He was going to give Doyle the very land that Vance and the Apache had been fighting over for years. It was the ultimate consolidation of power. But why was the deed here, with the journals? Why hadn't Croft given it to Doyle? The answer was as simple as it was chilling. Croft never intended for Doyle to collect his reward. Doyle knew too much. The plan was always for Doyle to retrieve the journals and then disappear. Cobb and Reno weren't just there to betray Vance. They were there to eliminate Doyle once the job was done. Doyle's death at the cabin had simply saved them the trouble. This chest didn't just contain proof of old sins. It contained the proof of Judge Croft's most recent conspiracy. It was the smoking gun. "What is it?" Ayanna asked, seeing the look on his face. He showed her the deed. Croft wasn't just covering his tracks. He was planning a coup. With Vance gone, and this land in the hands of his puppet, he would have controlled the whole Southern Territory. They were no longer just fugitives carrying evidence. They were the sole obstacle standing in the way of a tyrant's absolute power. The stakes had been raised yet again. After 3 more grueling days, they reached the Apache stronghold. It was a place of breathtaking, impossible beauty. A hidden valley nestled in the heart of the volcanic wasteland, fed by a series of underground springs that created a lush, green paradise. It was a secret the Apache had kept for generations. They were welcomed not as heroes, but as harbingers of a war that had now reached the borders of this sacred place. The elders listened gravely as Ayanna and Taza recounted their story. The chest and its dark contents were brought before the tribal council. A debate raged for a day and a night. Some argued to destroy the journals, to burn the white man's poison, and retreat back into their isolation. "Fighting their world will only destroy our own," one elder warned. "Their world is already at our door," Ayanna argued passionately. "We can't hide from it. Hiding is just a slower way to die." "This," she said, placing her hand on the chest, "this is a weapon. It is the only weapon we have that they will understand. We must use it." In the end, it was Thomas they turned to, the outsider, the ghost. "You know their world," the eldest chief said, his ancient eyes fixed on Thomas. "You know their way of war. What do you say?" Thomas looked at the faces around the fire. He saw the fear, the anger, the proud defiance. He thought of his years in solitude, trying to escape the violence and corruption of his world. But he had been wrong. You couldn't escape it. You could only turn and face it. "There is only one way," Thomas said, his voice clear and steady. "We can't win a war of guns against Judge Croft. He has more men, more money, more power. But the one thing he doesn't have is the truth. We don't take the journals to the law in Santa Fe. The law belongs to him. We take them over his head. We take them to a place where even his power can't reach." "Where is this place?" the chief asked. "It's not a place," Thomas said. "It's a person. There's a journalist in San Francisco, a man named Frederick Hayes. He's made a career out of exposing corrupt politicians. He despises men like Senator Palmer. If we can get this chest to him, he won't just publish the story. He'll start a fire that will burn all the way to Washington." It was a desperate, near-impossible plan. San Francisco was 1,000 miles away, across deserts, mountains, and land controlled by their enemies. "How can we get it there?" Taza asked. "One rider could never make it." "Not one rider," Thomas said, a daring plan forming in his mind. 4. He laid it out. They would use deception. 4 different riders would leave the stronghold, heading in 4 different directions. 3 would carry decoys, heavily guarded, designed to draw Croft's attention. The 4th rider, traveling alone, lightly, and by the most unexpected route, would carry the real journals. "It's a suicide mission for the decoys," Taza said grimly. "It's a fighting chance for the truth," Thomas countered. There was no argument. The plan was audacious, but it was the only one they had. Taza himself would lead one decoy party north. Another warrior would lead a second party east. Nakai, his face set with a new, hard-earned resolve, volunteered to lead the third party south, back toward the Mexican border. That left the true messenger, the one who would carry the real prize. "I will go," Ayanna said before anyone could speak. "I will take it west." No, Thomas said immediately. It's too dangerous. You're the leader of your people. They need you here. They need a future, she corrected him, her gaze unwavering. This is the only way to secure it, and I am the best one for the job. I know the trails. I can move unseen. He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He also knew he couldn't let her go alone. Then I'm going with you, he said. Thomas, no, she protested. Your role is here, to help organize the defense in case Croft's men find this place. My role, he said, his voice quiet but absolute, is to see this through to the end. I didn't come back from the dead just to hide behind your walls. We started this together, Ayanna. We'll finish it together. They looked at each other across the fire, the unspoken truth passing between them. This was more than a mission now. It was a partnership, forged in chaos and sealed in a shared purpose. The council agreed. The next morning, as the sun rose over the black lava fields, the four parties prepared to depart. The ledgers were carefully wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in a false bottom of Ayanna's saddlebag. 3 other identical saddlebags were prepared for the decoys. Nakai embraced his sister. Be safe, he whispered. You are a warrior now, my brother, she replied, her voice thick with pride. Make our ancestors proud. He then turned to Thomas and offered his hand. Thank you for everything. Thomas shook it, seeing the boyish fear in his eyes replaced by a man's determination. One by one, the 3 decoy parties rode out, fanning out from the stronghold, their dust trails a deliberate, defiant message to anyone who might be watching. Thomas and Ayanna waited until midday. Then alone they rode west toward the setting sun and the distant promise of the ocean. They were 2 small figures in a vast hostile world, carrying a secret that could save a nation or get them killed. The chase was on, and the fate of the territory rested on the shoulders of the ghost and the Apache warrior. For 2 weeks they rode. They moved through the world like phantoms, sleeping during the blistering heat of the day and traveling under the cold light of the stars. Ayanna's knowledge of the land was uncanny. She led them through forgotten canyons and over high, windswept mesas, on trails that weren't on any map. Thomas, in turn, watched their back trail, his old scouting skills honed to a razor's edge, constantly searching for any sign of pursuit. They heard whispers in the small, scattered settlements they skirted, whispers of a war brewing in the territory. 3 separate posses, funded by Judge Croft, were tearing the land apart, hunting for a band of renegade Apaches and their white leader. The decoys were working. Taza, Nakai, and the others were leading Croft's forces on a wild goose chase, buying them precious time. But their luck couldn't last forever. They were crossing the great salt flats of Utah when Thomas spotted them, a glint of sunlight on metal miles behind them. It wasn't a posse. It was too small, too professional. 5 riders moving with the relentless pace of wolves. He must have a tracker, Thomas said, his voice grim. Someone who knows this land as well as you do. There is only one man like that, Ayanna said, a look of dread on her face. An Apache outcast named Kale. He sold his services to the army years ago. Croft must have hired him. They pushed their horses to the limit, the unforgiving white landscape offering no cover, no place to hide. But the 5 riders gained on them, slowly, steadily. They were being run to ground. At the edge of the salt flats, they found their only hope, a maze of sandstone buttes and canyons, a final sanctuary or a perfect trap. They rode into the labyrinth just as the sun was setting, the rocks glowing blood red. They found a defensible spot, a high box canyon with only one entrance, and a small spring seeping from the rock. They made their stand. There was no more running. As darkness fell, they saw a single campfire flicker to life a few miles away. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. They knew they had them trapped. They'll come at dawn, Thomas said, checking his rifle and pistol for the 10th time. They had enough ammunition for a fight, but not a siege. Then we will be ready, Ayanna said calmly. She was sharpening her knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a comforting sound in the tense silence. They sat together, their backs against a rock, watching the stars emerge in the vast, indifferent sky. The end felt very near. Thomas, Ayanna said softly, not looking at him, before the fight comes, I want to thank you. For what? He asked, his voice rough. For getting you into this mess? No, she said, finally turning to him. Her eyes in the faint starlight were deep and luminous. For showing me that not all ghosts are to be feared. You ran from your past for so long, but when the time came, you turned and fought it. You reminded my people, and me, that one person's courage can change everything. You're the one with the courage, he countered. You started this. You declared war on a king with nothing but a story and a desperate hope. A small smile touched her lips. We make a good team, you and I, the ghost and the warrior. Yeah, he said, a lump forming in his throat. We do. In the silence that followed, a truth he had been pushing away for weeks finally surfaced. His solitude hadn't been penance. It had been fear. Fear of feeling anything again. Fear of connection, of loss. And this woman, this incredible, fierce, intelligent woman, had broken through all of it. She had made him feel alive again, even on the eve of his likely death. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. She saw it in his eyes. She reached out and placed her hand on his. Her touch was warm, steady, a promise, a prayer. They faced the dawn together. As the first rays of light painted the canyon walls, the attack came. But it was not the frontal assault they expected. Kale, the Apache tracker, knew his business. Two men laid down covering fire from the rocks below, pinning them down, while the other three, including Kale himself, began scaling the sheer canyon walls on either side of them, moving with the agility of mountain goats. It was a classic pincer movement. They were trapped. I'll take the climbers, Thomas yelled, firing his rifle at the figures scrambling up the rocks. You keep the others busy. Ayana laid down a steady, accurate fire, forcing the men below to stay behind cover. The canyon echoed with the roar of gunfire. Thomas hit one of the climbers. The man screamed and tumbled from the cliff face, his body bouncing off the rocks below. But the other two kept coming. Cal was a phantom, using every crack and crevice for cover, moving with terrifying speed. A bullet struck the rock next to Thomas's head, spraying his face with stone fragments. He was exposed. He saw Cale raise his rifle for a final, clear shot. This is it, he thought. Then a blur of motion from Ayana's side. She had abandoned her position and was running directly at the canyon wall beneath Cal, her knife clenched in her hand. It was a suicidal move, but she wasn't attacking. She was a diversion. Her desperate charge drew Cale's attention for a single, vital second. It was all Thomas needed. He sighted his rifle and fired. The shot was true. Cal grunted and lost his footing, his rifle clattering down the rocks. He dangled for a moment from one hand, then peeled away from the wall, landing with a sickening thud on the canyon floor. The last climber, seeing his leader fall, lost his nerve and began to retreat. The two gunmen below, their plan in tatters, broke cover and ran for their horses. Thomas and Ayana didn't let them go. A cold, grim efficiency took over. They fired together, moving and shooting like a single practiced unit. The last two of Croft's men fell in the dust. Silence. The ringing in their ears, the smell of smoke. They had done it. They had survived. They walked to the edge of the canyon and looked down at the bodies. Then they looked at each other. They were bruised, bleeding, exhausted. But they were alive, and they were together. Without a word, Thomas pulled her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, her body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. He held her tight, the feel of her solid and real in his arms, a bulwark against all the ghosts of his past. The war was not over, but this battle, this impossible, desperate battle, was won. The rest of the journey was a blur of exhaustion and grim determination. They took the horses and supplies from Croft's dead men and pushed west, never staying in one place for more than a few hours, haunted by the fear that more hunters were on their trail. They finally reached San Francisco a month later, looking more like beggars than saviors. The city was a chaotic, roaring beast of noise and crowds, a world away from the desert silence they knew. Finding the journalist, Frederick Hayes, was easier than they expected. He worked for the city's most prominent newspaper, a bulldog of a man with ink-stained fingers and tired, cynical eyes. He listened to their incredible story in his cluttered office, his expression a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. Then Thomas laid the journals and the deed on his desk. As Hayes began to read, his cynicism melted away, replaced by a look of utter jaw-dropping shock. He read for an hour, the silence in the room broken only by the frantic scratching of his own notes. When he finally looked up, his eyes were blazing with the fire of the biggest story of his career. "If this is real," Hayes whispered, his voice hoarse, "this doesn't just take down a territorial judge. This will end Senator Palmer. This could shake the entire government." The story broke a week later. It was an explosion. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a special edition with facsimiles of the journal pages and the deed printed on the front page. The headline was simple, stark, and devastating. "The Palmer Poisons, a Legacy of Massacre and Blackmail." The telegraph wires hummed. The story was picked up by newspapers in Chicago, New York, Washington. It was a national scandal. Senator Palmer denied everything, of course. Judge Croft declared it all a fabrication, a smear campaign by his enemies. But the evidence was undeniable. Congressional hearings were convened. Warrants were issued. Judge Alistair Croft, cornered and with his empire crumbling, chose a coward's way out. He was found in his study, a single gunshot wound to the head. Senator Palmer was stripped of his office and indicted on charges of war crimes and corruption. The foundation of their power, built on secrets and blood, had been shattered by the truth. In the aftermath, the full story of the territorial war came out. The stories of Taza and Nakai, leading posses on a desperate chase to protect a secret, became the stuff of legend. The government, in an effort to distance itself from the scandal, nullified all of Croft's land grants, including the one that had dispossessed so many settlers and Apache tribes. For the first time in a generation, there was a chance for real justice in the territory. Thomas and Ayanna watched it all unfold from a small, rented room in San Francisco. They had done it. The ghosts were finally laid to rest. "What now?" Thomas asked one evening, as they watched the fog roll in over the bay. "Now I go home," Ayanna said. "My people need to rebuild. We have a future to fight for." She looked at him, her expression soft. "What about you, Thomas Whitmore? Your name is cleared. You are no longer a ghost. You can go anywhere, be anyone." He thought about it. He could disappear again, find a new cabin, a new patch of solitude. But the thought of it felt cold, empty. The silence he had once craved now seemed like a punishment. "I think," he said slowly, taking her hand, "I'm tired of running. I think I'm finally ready to go home too." He looked into her eyes. "If you'll have me." A smile, bright and beautiful as a desert sunrise, spread across her face. Our stronghold could always use a good watchman. They returned not as fugitives, but as heroes. The journey back was different. The land no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a promise. Thomas Whitmore, the hermit, had died in that desert. In his place was a man who had found his purpose, his courage, and his heart in the most unexpected of places. The treasure they had found wasn't gold or silver. It was something far more rare. It was justice. It was redemption. And for the ghost and the warrior, it was a new beginning. Together, under the wide, open skies of a land they had fought to set free. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of forgotten history and unlikely heroes, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. You never know what other secrets are buried out there, just waiting to be uncovered.